Hello, and welcome to Science on the Seventh live stream, a virtual space where we talk about topics related to air quality and health. I'm your host, Pallavi Pant. As some of you may have seen in the news recently, several cities in South Asia have been experiencing really high levels of air pollution in the last couple of weeks, especially in the last few days. Lahore in Pakistan, in particular, has been in the news. We have some images here that were shared by a journalist on X, similar images coming up from people elsewhere, really highlighting what those really high levels of air pollution look like, poor visibility, not being really able to tell what time of day it is, and continuously experiencing this for days at end. This is something that millions of people experience at different parts of the year throughout the world. And we know that there are solutions to this problem. At the same time, throughout this year, we have also been hearing news about climate driven weather events and extreme heat that millions of people experience, not just in South Asia, but in other parts of the world. And increasingly, there are calls for thinking about integrated solutions for air pollution and climate change. With the COP meeting coming up, which is the annual meeting where policymakers from around the world and many other experts, activists, communicators gather to talk about climate action, comes up later this month, it is important for us to take a few minutes to think about what are these linkages between air pollution and climate, and why are we talking about these integrated solutions? So, to help us unpack some of this, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Chandra Venkataraman. Chandra is the founding head of Center for Climate Studies at the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay, in India. And she also serves on the scientific advisory panel for the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, among many other activities that she does. Welcome, Chandra. We are very excited to have you here.
Thank you, Pallavi. It's such a pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Amazing. So let me start with this. I just talked about cities in India and in Pakistan experiencing high levels of air pollution. We've also seen just in the last week, Bangladesh releasing its national air quality management plan. And this is not new. This is not surprising. This happens year after year, especially during this, October to January, February period. So from your point of view, what is driving the air pollution problem, especially in India? And then what do you think about South Asia more broadly?
Um, I'd like to respond to that by essentially saying that um, we do have very, very strong evidence that it's emissions, and the emission sources, the amount of both in terms of air pollution. If we're talking about the particles, then the particles as such, as well as the gases that then may stay as gases, may convert to particles. So if we're talking about air pollution being, let's say, the two primary big players being particles, the lung penetrating ones, particle mass smaller than 2.5 micron, which is called PM 2.5, and the other sort of major one being ozone, which is produced in the atmosphere. We really are talking about the multiple emission sources that put out both directly the particles as well as the precursors to form secondary particles and to form ozone. There has been some discussion about how climate change feeds back to air pollution, and our best understanding is that as far as human created air pollution goes, climate change could lead to certain types of stabilization of the atmosphere, compressing pollutants a little closer to the ground. It could, lead to some, temperature changes, but really it's more to do with the fact that you have the stabilization. And that, as we understand, is an effect which is capped within 5 to 10% of having the ability to increase levels. But really, the focus in the history of air pollution, where we've had all of these successes in other places, has been to address the emission sources and to lead to emissions control. And of course, we need to know how to prioritize them to get our best reductions, and what are the best strategies and approaches. So squarely putting the blame, if you will, on identifying activities that we have the opportunity to change and go towards capping emissions, abating emissions, reducing, mitigating emissions to improve air quality.
Yeah,
Um,
I think
Please, yeah.
it, I think it's really important that you say that um, the real sort of solution to the problem is reducing emissions and identifying those sources that are contributing the most to air pollution. Earlier this year we also spoke with Dawar Butt, who has been working in the air quality space in Pakistan. He mentioned something similar, thinking about what are the biggest sources, how do we track them. And for those of you listening in, please check out our conversation with him if you want to learn more about the air pollution landscape in Pakistan, what the biggest sources are, and also what is being done to control it. But going back to what you said about identifying and prioritizing the most important sources, I think one of the other questions or considerations has been at what scale do we need to bring these controls? Is it city? Is it national? Is it something in between, or all of it? And can you tell us a little bit more what the science tells us in that regard?
The in the history of air pollution, there's been the idea that urban centers are some of the largest emitters, and therefore a lot of the focus has been on looking at urban centers in terms of their emissions, in terms of control strategies, and so on and so forth. Um, and of course, with the developed countries, the big shift was away from coal as a solid fuel as a first measure towards abating air pollution from the 50s, 60s, 70s onwards. Now, we have multiple lines of evidence that the mix of sources is far more complex in the Indian, South Asian, perhaps in other developing country contexts as well. And since I, maybe have the biggest or experience in India, I might, like to just give a more clearer picture of India. So one of our, I think, startling findings. So far, the air pollution control has focused on identifying cities which are highly polluted to try and institute controls. Now, we have, for example, tools called emission inventories on the scale of 5 kilometers all over India, let's say a spatial resolution. And so we can ask, what are the emissions on city levels? What are the emissions on total levels? And one of the big findings, and we're trying to make this known more widely, is that if we add up all the now non-attainment city emissions as identified, it accounts for anywhere from 10 to 20% of emissions of both primary PM2.5 and some of the precursor gases. So really the largest emissions lie outside of the cities. And when I say 10 to 20%, it is adding all the 131 or so, and then comparing to how it compares to the total emissions over India. So there really is an urgent need to expand the focus beyond city scales. And, we're not the only person seeing that or saying that. People have understood that there is a discussion on moving to an airshed scale for management of air pollution. So, there's very much a need to shift the paradigm from this idea of urban air pollution. It really is a huge regional problem. It is a pan India problem and definitely not limited to urban centers. If there's a chance to also talk a little bit about the contrast, if you look at urban sources where we have the best measurements, where we have the best information and data and modeling on the sources, the mix of sources is going to see a domination, a little bit of transport, of industry, sometimes thermal power generation. But if you then look at the non-urban sources, which now we're saying account for anywhere from 80 to 90% of the emissions, there's a complete different. They are dominated by a lot of biomass use, whether it is in the residential sector as energy, whether it is for waste disposal in the agriculture sector or in the waste management sector, and so on and so forth. So we have this idea that uh, we have to really look beyond the traditional, let's look at energy, transport, and industry and solve the air pollution problem, because we have something much more complex than that. And look beyond the let's address the coal burning, which worked in other places, but understand that we have formal sectors and informal sectors, with the informal being residential agriculture, and we have the coal in the formal sector, but also the biomass in the informal sector, which we have to find ways to address.
Yeah, I think this is such a critical point, because also a lot of times when we are thinking about what are the biggest sources of air pollution, naturally, perhaps in some cases, the eye turns to the most immediate source that you can see around you. For a lot of people, it would be something like vehicles, because you can see them. And of course, they are a big source, especially as the number of vehicles goes up. But some of the more diffuse sources, even things like burning of waste, as a way of reducing waste overall in the absence of other types of waste management practices, can be a big contributor, not just in urban environments, but even in like peri-urban, semi-urban, and rural environments. So feel like you're raising so many important points here about reducing emissions at source, thinking about the larger picture. We need to address sources that are relevant at different scales,
Yes,
and
yes.
bear in mind the contrast between what may be happening in an urban setting vis-a-vis what might be happening elsewhere. Think somewhat related to this, and thinking again about the larger picture, we've heard time and time again that air pollution and climate change are interconnected. In fact, we did a video a couple of years ago, and I want to play a short clip from it. So if we can pull that up and watch it for just a minute.
The two largest threats to human health over the last 100 years are air pollution and climate change. This is a very complex problem. In order to find the most optimal solution, we should be thinking about the system rather than a problem separately.
Right. So interconnected problem. We should be thinking about it as a system and thinking about, common solutions. Can you help us understand and unpack this? Like, interconnected how? And what systems should we be thinking about?
So, if this is the right time, I'd like to introduce short-lived climate pollutants as a class of pollutants, and these several of these short-lived climate forces or short-lived climate pollutants, what characterizes them, and that's black carbon, methane, and other ozone precursor gases, as we call them. So, organic gases, as well as which arise from different kinds of combustion, and then the nitrogen oxides, which largely, come from transport and coal combustion type of sources. These really last in the atmosphere for short periods of time than the long lived greenhouse gases. But the interesting thing about them is that they're much stronger in terms of their ability to warm the atmosphere. So, on a per unit mass basis, we say that black carbon is approximately about 1,000 times more powerful than CO2, despite its short lifetime. So, within that short lifetime itself, it's able to add 1,000 times more warming energy per unit mass that we emit. Right? It's the same with methane being about 85 times, some of these other gases. Then all of them have the stronger warming potential. This, and many of these, as we are seeing, are also ingredients of air pollution because black carbon is in particles, the ones that penetrate the lung. The ozone precursor gases then form ozone, which is a criteria air pollutant. The opportunity is that if we address sources that lead to the emissions of these or lead to the emission of the precursors of these pollutants, because of their short lifetimes, when we stop the emissions, their atmospheric levels can drop rather quickly on the time scale of decades rather than the centuries, and there's no denying we need to take the long-term climate action. But much of the, what the climate community is now seeing as the 1.5 degree centigrade pathways cannot be achieved by action on greenhouse gases alone. And acting on sources that are common to short lived climate forces and air pollution gives us a control on slowing down the intensity of climate change, which has already become too intense, right? And so it makes absolute sense to get control on the temperature trajectory in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, by trying to identify the sources that will give us this rapid climate and clean air action while continuing to do the long term climate action. So, it gives us an opportunity. We know enough to prioritize and identify these sources. The communities have remained a little apart. And so the challenge is to, integrate, and the action plans have also remained on national scales, at least in India, quite disconnected from each other. So the real sort of opportunity as well as the challenge is to bring in integration between them.
Yeah, I think it's, like interesting that you're talking also about the sense of scale at which we are looking to bring some of these changes. And of course, like, thinking in the context of air pollution specifically, reducing some of these emissions will also bring immediate air quality benefits and public health benefits as an extension of that. Knowing that 8 million people are dying every year as a result of air pollution, it's a big enough number. So it is critical that we think about which sources and which source controls are going to bring the most action quickly. I think the other thing that I'm curious to hear more about from you is when we're thinking about air quality action or climate action, there's that backdrop of energy choices or energy solutions that may be available to people, or that may be affordable, or that may be accessible in some cases. And like, either from the perspective of your work in India or generally, how do you think energy policies or energy decisions are playing into air quality or climate action, and what kinds of energy policies will help us move towards that goal for clean air, improved air quality, etc.?
So that's a great question. Thank you, Pallavi. I think what we're looking at is the whole idea of bringing sustainable development and sustainable development goals right to the center of climate action. And of course, you know, the produce the reducing the health burden directly links to air quality, as you pointed out, right? So with energy policy, I know that the focus in places like India has been a lot on greenhouse gases, and therefore the low carbon pathways for development have addressed industry and energy generation, and that of course is welcome. But the other thing we find, if we look at the short-lived climate forces and look at what kind of energy policies may then deliver these benefits, they give us a surprising answer that it's really the informal sector and energy policies to provide access to clean energy, gaseous rather than solid fuels, related to residential, cooking, heating, energy access. Um, and a variety of of course, sustainable agricultural practices that move away from different kinds of open burning, but also that identifying a bunch of activities that are in what is called the informal economy, which rely on let's say traditional, not very well engineered technologies, and these fuels that can either be scavenged or biomass fuels. So, what's interesting about this is that it puts development, um, equity in terms of the environmental justice, equity in terms of gender equity. It puts all of them into a set of actions that can sort of address all these multiple goals. And it's particularly interesting that it is right in the center of the development agenda. And to show that the development agenda then can benefit air quality and climate if we accelerate it, if that's the way people want to go. Because the climate community talks about energy, the air pollution community talks about more controlling emissions, and the development community is kind of talking about development and is not integrated into any of them. So it's complex to get three communities to integrate, but that's the complexity we have to address, to solve this problem.
Yeah, I like how you're, sort of framing this also, because it is true that in each of the different communities, the way that we've looked at the problems or the way that we've framed what the solutions might be has been somewhat disconnected. So it's like we're all speaking in different languages, but we're trying to get to the same point. And if we can find ways to align what the messaging is and how, in some ways, how inclusive the messaging is. So in thinking about the air quality solutions, are how are we thinking about the equity goals, and how are we thinking about improvements in like people's social and economic well-being as well, because those are things that not just India but most of the countries, low and middle income countries, will not be able to ignore. That's a central part of any decision making process. So I like your message about trying to find common ground and looking for reinforcement of messages, and looking for also like joint strategies in some ways. Now, you are somebody who's worked in this space for a long time, and I would, dare say that you have been one of the people who has like one foot in the air pollution side of things and one foot in the climate side of things. I'm curious about what got you interested to look at, this sort of very complex topic as an area of work? And how have you seen the fields evolve and grow in the time that you have been working on these issues?
I mean, interesting question. I started my career talking about, particulate air pollution. And so when atmospheric particles became implicated in climate change, right? That was a sort of natural extension. I've always had this very strong interest in people science and this idea of science serving society, and that too, a much greater interest in the informal sectors, which are, of course, much, much harder to kind of start to have transformation on the ground. So I think that's sort of how it happened, that, on the science side, yes, there was a connect and there's all these interesting things to find out. But then now the really big thing is, how do we translate that into action? And I think, the communications you all do, the bridge with policy, the bridge with think tanks, these are all the things that, where um, we need to strengthen those interfaces to really kind of take it forward. Of course, interdisciplinary teaching and research, so education and research, is the core to address, the big challenges. So the grand challenges are going to require an interdisciplinary approach. And so, setting up an interdisciplinary kind of program and climate studies that goes all the way from, the science through the impacts and to the adaptation and the human impact. So we really kind of have taken a broad view of it in the Center for Climate Studies here at IIT Bombay. So that, finally is the one that's probably going to give us our best solutions, if you would, right? At least in understanding them and then thinking about how to create change on the ground.
No, that makes sense. I think also, like, in terms of the program you just mentioned, and you were, of course, the founder for this interdisciplinary program on climate studies, which was one of the first programs in India to offer a PhD on the topic. And I'm curious if you have any advice to others who may be thinking about similar programs in their settings, either in or outside India, and what you would offer as, wisdom to them.
So, I think two broad sort of approaches. One, of course, is curriculum becomes really important when you're talking about interdisciplinary programs. And that's why we started at a postgraduate level saying that let's see what is a core curriculum above the basic training across different disciplines. But it did create a challenge to maintain a science stream and a policy stream, right? And so, how to connect those. And so that's one part of it. So thinking of curricula, setting curricula, and then from a PhD level, we're starting a master's program. And of course, there's new leadership at the center, and it's evolved very nicely. So, then that takes us to the next step of climate and sustainability is our master's program. So curricula that don't sacrifice the depth, if you would, while giving enough of breadth to really address these problems. That's one. And the other, of course, is inducing academics to step out of their comfort zones and collaborate with people who speak a different language. And, the way we achieved it was by saying we're happy to offer some fellowships to PhD candidates, but it has to be guided across disciplines. You have to have two people who come from different disciplines who decide to try and step out. And then we're happy to support a fellowship. And there were some very interesting, very surprising, and very enduring partnerships that have formed as result of that. So I think those are sorts of things that we can offer as part of our experience to others to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, amazing. I'm like intrigued that you sort of talked about stepping out of your comfort zone, which is probably a true statement in so many different situations in life. But it is true, like often doing interdisciplinary work or working, with people that may bring a different perspective into the problem is challenging, but often also the most rewarding piece of the puzzle in some sense. And I think one other question that I have for you is looking at all the moments where we have or have not made progress so far. What gives you hope for the future? Because that's the thing that keeps us, going and keeps us working towards that ultimate goal of clean air and good health for everyone.
Absolutely. And I think, there is in India, and I think in many developing countries now, strong stakeholder agreement across stakeholders in government, industry, citizens group, think tanks, etc., that air pollution has to be solved. And getting so many stakeholders to agree on the fact that this is a problem that has to be solved has been fantastic. And of course, it's a question of devising these strategies, monitoring the implementation, taking it back, and having a bunch of tools to be able to underpin action uh, with scientific knowledge. But I think it's ripe with the development of new tools, with the engagement of a wide variety of people and of course the measurements as well, going public and keeping them available to everybody for analysis. So all of that together gives us hope. And we've had the first phase of the clean air program. It's going into its second phase. Hopefully we're able to participate to inform and suggest measures for efficacy improvement and so on and so forth. So it's a solvable problem. It has been solved in other regions. We need to find our solution that works and our, mechanisms to actually implement it. I hope we'll be seeing blue skies in 10 years, perhaps. I hope.
No, that actually, yeah, that also keeping in mind that this is a long game. It's taken other countries time and lots of sustained targeted work to get to that place where the air starts to get cleaner and then stay cleaner as well. There is one question that has come in from one of the listeners, Bhupendra. Thank you, Bhupendra, for your question. I think this is a question that is on so many people's mind right now. We think about electric vehicles as one of the solutions to reduce pollution, to also try and address climate, greenhouse gas reduction. But at the same time, there is a bit of a trade-off with the use of lithium-ion batteries and what it would mean both to extract these precious metals and then also to deal with the battery waste when we get to that stage. And how do we think about those, and what is some of the current thinking on that question?
So, I mean, people who approach this from what they call life cycle analysis are the ones that can answer, what happens really from cradle to grave of a technology. I think that analysis has to be done technology by technology and particular to evaluate different solutions. It's a bit out of my expertise. I think the broad things I would say is that we need to first understand whether just reducing the tailpipe emissions is giving us a huge health benefit, right? Um, that is the electricity that is fed into uh, these vehicles then renewably generated at the source, right? So you kind of need to have also an overall idea of when we're electrifying the fleet, is it an intermediate solution for particular cities, you know, uh, for a short term while other solutions kick in? My our own understanding is that addressing the residential sector, greening residential energy, making it fully gas based. And, I'm not saying it has to be fossil gas, it can be compressed biogas, it can be, biogas generated from waste, whatever it is. Maybe greening residential energy might be really the top priority, which will give the biggest um, regional scale benefits, is one of the takeaways. Over and above that, on city scales, definitely looking at shifts in transport is an important measure.
Great. Thank you so much, Chandra. And also, we'll pop in the chat some analysis that the Institute for Clean Air and sorry, I'm going to mess this up, but ICCT has done, trying to look at all of these questions related to EVs. So please check that out. And we will also try and address this, the issue of EVs in a future session. So Bhupendra, thank you for raising that question today. And Chandra, thank you so much for joining us today. What I'm taking away from this conversation is a few different things, starting with thinking about various scales at which action can be relevant and impactful, and thinking about sources in that framework, trying to also think about this notion that we do have enough data to act. We really need to pick the pieces that are going to bring us the most benefit and really run with them, implement those solutions. And then third, which I think is really critical for all of us, is people that work in this extremely increasingly collaborative environment, which is be comfortable with being uncomfortable, and working with people whose language you may not always understand, but taking steps to learn it and try and find and co-create solutions together. So thank you so very much for your time today, and for all of the work that you've done for so long, and all of the work that you will continue to do. We'll be following that and using that in our work. And for
That's
everyone
a
listening,
great summary, Pallavi. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. And I'm looking forward to future conversations, and
yes, me too.
hopefully continue collaboration.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time. And for anyone who was listening in, thank you so much as well. We will be hosting our final live stream for 2024 on Friday, December 6th, where we will do a recap of all the clean air wins in 2024, so that we're ready and charged to go into 2025 to do some more work. So join us on Friday, December 6th. Until then, take care and stay safe. Goodbye, everyone.